There is one mistake that quietly destroys a person's psychological power before they even realize it. The moment they feel ignored, they immediately try to regain attention. They send another message. They explain themselves. They become more available than before. It feels like the right thing to do. But in reality, every desperate attempt to recover someone's attention reveals something the human mind notices instantly. It reveals who depends on whom. And in the hidden world of human psychology, dependence always weakens influence. This is the first dark principle of ignoring people. The person who needs attention the least quietly holds the greatest psychological advantage. Not because they are more intelligent, not because they are more attractive, but because they are no longer controlled by the fear of losing someone's attention. Human beings are constantly observing emotional dependence. Most of the time, without even realizing it, the way you respond to silence, the way you react when someone pulls away, the way you behave when attention disappears, all of these become invisible signals that people use to measure your emotional strength. Imagine this: two people stop receiving messages from someone they care about. The first immediately becomes restless. They check their phone every few minutes. They begin overthinking every conversation. They wonder if they said something wrong. Finally, they decide to send another message, then another soon. Their entire emotional state depends on whether someone else replies. Now imagine the second person. They notice the silence, but they don't chase it. They don't force conversation. They don't sacrifice their peace to recover someone else's attention. Instead, they continue living their life, working, learning, growing, smiling, moving forward. The silence changes nothing about who they are. Now ask yourself, which person appears emotionally stronger? The answer is obvious, because confidence is never measured by how much attention you receive. It is measured by how little your peace depends on receiving it. This is where dark psychology begins. People unconsciously respect emotional self-control. They may never admit it, but they feel it. The moment they realize your emotions cannot be controlled through attention, something changes inside their mind. They begin questioning their own position. Why aren't they reacting? Why didn't they chase me? Why do they seem completely unaffected? Notice what happened. Without saying a single word, the focus has shifted. Instead of you thinking about them, they begin thinking about you. That is psychological leverage, not because you manipulated anyone, but because your emotional independence broke their expectations. The human brain depends on patterns. It predicts people's behavior before it happens. If someone always chases, the brain expects them to chase again. If someone always explains, the brain expects another explanation. If someone always seeks approval, the brain expects more approval-seeking behavior. But the moment that pattern suddenly disappears, the mind becomes alert. Broken patterns create curiosity. Curiosity creates attention, and attention creates psychological pressure. This is why emotionally disciplined people often appear mysterious, not because they hide themselves, but because they refuse to behave predictably. Most people cannot tolerate uncertainty. They immediately try to remove it. Emotionally powerful people do the opposite. They remain comfortable inside it. There is another hidden reason this principle works. Attention is emotional currency. Every conversation, every reply, every reaction is a form of investment. The more freely you give it away, the less valuable it becomes. But when your attention is protected, people begin recognizing that it has value. Think about someone who is available every hour of every day. Everyone expects them to answer. Everyone expects them to forgive. Everyone expects them to stay. Eventually, their attention feels ordinary. Now think about someone whose attention is earned. They are respectful, present, but candid, but they never abandon themselves simply to keep someone interested. Their attention feels different because it is limited, and the human mind naturally values what is limited. This is not about becoming cold. It is not about pretending you don't care. It is about refusing to let fear make your decisions. The moment fear controls your actions, someone else quietly gains influence over your emotions. That is exactly what dark psychology teaches. People are not always influenced by force. Very often, they are influenced by emotional dependence. Roam that dependence, and you remove the invisible control others once had over you. Eventually, people stop seeing you as someone who needs their attention. They begin seeing you as someone who chooses where their attention goes. That small psychological shift changes everything, because in every relationship, the person who can remain calm without demanding attention is usually the person whose attention becomes the most valuable. And once people realize they can no longer control your emotions through attention alone, the balance of power silently begins to move in your favor. Imagine walking away from a conversation without explaining yourself. No long message, no emotional speech, no desperate attempt to make the other person understand your side, just silence. To most people, that seems like weakness. They assume that if you don't defend yourself, people will misunderstand you, but the dark psychology of human behavior reveals something completely different. Silence does not always end a conversation. Very often, it begins one inside the other person's mind. And the conversations people have with themselves are usually far more powerful than the words you could have spoken. The human brain is uncomfortable with missing information. Whenever a story feels incomplete, the mind immediately tries to complete it. This is known as the need for psychological closure. People crave certainty. They want clear answers, clear intentions, clear endings. The moment those answers disappear, the brain refuses to let go. Instead, it keeps replaying the situation over and over again. Think about the last movie you watched with an unexpected ending. Chances are you kept thinking about it long after it was over. Not because it answered every question, but because it left some unanswered. Human relationships work in exactly the same way. When someone suddenly stops explaining themselves, stops defending every accusation, or quietly walks away without creating drama, the other person's mind begins searching for meaning. Why didn't they argue? Why weren't they trying to convince me? Do they know something I don't? Asterisk, have I misunderstood them? These questions appear naturally, not because someone planted them, but because silence created an empty space, and the human mind cannot tolerate empty spaces for long. It begins filling them with imagination. That is where dark psychology quietly takes over. Reality becomes less important than perception. The other person is no longer reacting to what you actually did. They begin reacting to the story their own mind has created. Sometimes they imagine you are angry. Sometimes they imagine you no longer care. Sometimes they imagine you have moved on. Sometimes they imagine you know something they don't. Notice something fascinating. You never said any of those things. Their own imagination created them. That is why silence often becomes more psychologically powerful than explanation. Most people unknowingly destroy this advantage. The moment they feel misunderstood, they rush to explain themselves. They send paragraph after paragraph trying to prove their intentions. They answer questions that were never even asked. Every explanation feels necessary, but each one removes another layer of mystery. Eventually, nothing remains for the other person to wonder about. Everything becomes predictable. Everything becomes certain. And certainty ends psychological tension. Powerful people understand that not every misunderstanding needs to be corrected immediately. Sometimes time reveals more than words ever can. Sometimes silence protects your dignity better than endless explanations. This does not mean allowing lies to spread without reason, nor does it mean refusing healthy communication in important relationships. It simply means understanding that you do not have to defend yourself against every opinion or satisfy every person's curiosity. The need to constantly explain yourself often comes from fear. Fear of rejection, fear of being judged, fear of losing someone's approval. But the moment your decisions are no longer controlled by those fears, your silence begins communicating confidence instead of insecurity. People can feel the difference. There is another psychological effect few people notice. When you explain everything, the conversation stays focused on you. When you remain calm and silent, the conversation quietly shifts inside the other person's mind. Instead of analyzing your emotions, they begin analyzing their own. Instead of questioning your behavior, They begin questioning their interpretation. That shift is incredibly powerful. Because people trust conclusions they reach themselves far more than conclusions forced upon them, no argument can compete with a realization that grows naturally inside someone's own mind. That is why strategic silence often leaves a deeper impression than endless discussion. It allows the imagination to work without interruption. And imagination is rarely neutral. It magnifies uncertainty. It magnifies curiosity. It magnifies emotional tension. This is why the people who appear the strongest are often the ones who feel no urgency to explain every action. They know their character will speak louder than temporary opinions. They know that peace is more valuable than winning every debate, and they understand that chasing understanding from everyone is a battle that can never truly be won. In the end, the darkest psychological truth is not that silence forces people to think about you. It is that silence hands their own imagination complete control over the story. And in most cases, the stories people create in their own minds become far more unforgettable than anything you could have ever said. There is a moment that every manipulative person fears. It isn't when you become angry. It isn't when you raise your voice. And it isn't when you threaten to leave. The moment they truly lose confidence is when they realize they can no longer control your emotional reactions. Because the dark psychology of ignoring people is not just about silence. It is about removing the emotional reward that others expected to receive from you. Most people don't realize how often their emotions are being tested. A sarcastic comment, a delayed reply, a dismissive attitude, a sudden change in behavior. These are not always random actions. Sometimes they are unconscious tests designed to answer one question. How much control do I have over this person? The answer is discovered through your reaction. If a small act of disrespect immediately makes you angry, the other person learns that your emotions are easy to trigger. If being ignored makes you panic, they learn that attention controls your peace. If criticism makes you desperately defend yourself, they learn exactly where your insecurity lives. Once someone discovers your emotional trigger, they can influence your behavior without ever using force. That is psychological control. Now imagine the opposite. Someone tries to provoke you. They expect frustration. They expect a defensive response. They expect you to explain yourself. Instead, you remain calm. You don't rush to react. You don't give them the emotional performance they were waiting for. Suddenly, the script changes, and broken scripts create discomfort. Human beings become unsettled when expected reactions disappear. Think about a magician. The trick works because your mind predicts what will happen next. The moment the prediction fails, your attention becomes completely focused. The same thing happens in human relationships. When someone expects anger and receives silence, expects desperation and receives calmness, expects chasing and receives distance, their confidence begins to weaken because they can no longer predict you. And whatever people cannot predict, they naturally become cautious around. This is why emotionally disciplined individuals often appear powerful without saying very much. Their reactions are not available for everyone to manipulate. Most people react instantly. They allow temporary emotions to make permanent decisions. But someone who pauses before responding creates a completely different psychological effect. The other person begins wondering, did I go too far? Why aren't they reacting? Are they unaffected? Have I lost influence over them? Notice what happened. The focus shifted. Instead of you defending your emotions, they began questioning their own position. That is the hidden power of emotional restraint. There is another reason this principle is so effective. Manipulation depends on feedback. A manipulative person needs to know whether their actions are working. Your anger gives feedback. Your desperation gives feedback. Your endless explanations give feedback, but calm silence gives almost nothing. Without feedback, their certainty disappears. And uncertainty creates psychological pressure. This does not mean becoming emotionless. You will still feel hurt, disappointed, frustrated. The difference is that you stop displaying every emotion the moment it appears. You choose your response instead of allowing your emotions to choose it for you. That choice changes everything. Imagine two people after being insulted. The first immediately argues. Hours later, the conflict continues. The second listens quietly, maintains composure, and walks away without needing the final word. Which person appears stronger? Almost always. The second, not because they felt nothing, but because they refused to surrender control of themselves. That is the dark psychological advantage. When people realize they can no longer disturb your peace with small provocations, their strategy begins to fail. The emotional reward disappears. And many of them unconsciously stop trying. Remember, the goal is not to ignore everyone. The goal is to stop rewarding behavior that seeks control over your emotional state. Every time you refuse to react impulsively, you strengthen your position. Every time you remain calm under pressure, you protect your power. Every time you deny someone the reaction they expected, you remind them that your emotions are not available for manipulation. Eventually, people begin approaching you differently, more carefully, more respectfully, because they understand something important. Your peace cannot be purchased with attention, and it cannot be stolen with provocation. In the end, the darkest psychological truth is not that ignoring people changes them. It is that refusing to provide predictable emotional reactions quietly breaks the control they believed they had over you. And once that control disappears, their confidence weakens, their certainty fades, and your silence becomes more powerful than any argument you could have won. Have you ever noticed how people rarely appreciate something that is always available? Air is essential for life, yet most people never think about it because it is constantly there. But the moment it becomes difficult to breathe, its value becomes impossible to ignore. Human relationships often follow the same psychological pattern. The more available your attention becomes, the more ordinary it begins to feel. And this is where one of the darkest principles of human psychology quietly begins to shape the way people value your presence. The human mind is deeply influenced by scarcity, not because scarce things are automatically better, but because scarcity forces attention. When something becomes limited, the brain immediately assigns greater value to it. This principle influences almost every area of life. Limited opportunities feel more important. Rare experiences become unforgettable. Exclusive access appears more desirable. The same psychological rule applies to your attention. If people know they can reach you whenever they want, if they know you will always reply first, always forgive, always remain available, your presence slowly becomes an expectation rather than a privilege. Expectation quietly destroys appreciation. Think about two different people. The first answers every message within seconds, changes their plans whenever someone calls, drops everything just to avoid disappointing others. Everyone knows they will always be there. At first, people admire their kindness, but over time, that kindness becomes predictable. And once something becomes predictable, the mind stops noticing it. Now imagine someone else. They are respectful, warm, present when it truly matters, but they also protect their time. They don't abandon their priorities to satisfy every request. They understand that attention is valuable, not because they believe they are superior, but because they respect their own life enough to give it boundaries. Which person's presence feels more meaningful? Almost always. The second, because people naturally value access that is earned, not access that is guaranteed. This is one of the quiet truths behind the dark psychology of ignoring people. Ignoring does not create value by itself. Value already exists. Ignoring simply reveals whether other people were capable of recognizing it. The moment your constant availability disappears, something changes inside the other person's mind. The routine is broken, and the brain immediately notices broken routines. Questions begin to appear. Why aren't they always here anymore? Have their priorities changed? Why doesn't my attention seem to affect them like before? Those questions create awareness, and awareness often creates appreciation. Most people never allow this process to happen. The moment they sense distance, they immediately close the gap. They call again, doxext again, explain again. Without realizing it, they remove every opportunity for someone else to experience life without their constant attention. And if someone never experiences your absence, they may never fully understand your value. There is another psychological effect that makes scarcity so powerful. Human beings unconsciously associate boundaries with self-respect. When someone protects their time, protects their energy, and protects their attention, others begin assuming those things must be valuable, not because they were told, but because human behavior communicates value more loudly than words. People believe what they observe, not what they hear. This is why emotionally strong individuals rarely advertise their worth. They simply refuse to give unlimited access to it. Remember, scarcity should never become manipulation. Creating fake distance just to make someone chase you is temporary. Eventually, people recognize the performance. Real psychological strength comes from genuinely building a life that cannot revolve around pleasing everyone. When your goals become meaningful, your attention naturally becomes more selective. When your peace becomes valuable, you stop giving emotional access to everyone who asks for it. That authenticity changes everything. People can sense when your absence comes from purpose rather than pride. One creates respect, the other creates resentment. Choose wisely, because the goal has never been to make people feel unimportant. The goal is to stop treating your own attention as if it has no value. Once you begin respecting your own time, other people slowly begin respecting it as well. That is how psychological influence quietly grows, not through force, not through manipulation, but through consistency. Eventually, people stop expecting unlimited access to your presence. Instead, they begin appreciating every moment they genuinely receive it. And that is the hidden power behind scarcity. The moment your attention is no longer something everyone can assume, they will always have, your presence becomes more meaningful, your absence becomes more noticeable, and your value becomes impossible for the human mind to ignore. There comes a point in every relationship when the truth quietly reveals itself, not through words, not through promises, but through absence. The moment you stop chasing, stop reminding, and stop carrying the entire connection by yourself, people reveal exactly how much they value your presence. This is one of the darkest psychological lessons most people never learn. As long as you keep doing all the work, you will never know who is actually willing to meet you halfway. Human nature has a strange habit. People often confuse convenience with loyalty. As long as someone keeps calling, keeps texting, keeps forgiving, keeps making the effort, everything feels normal. The relationship continues, not because both people are equally invested, but because one person refuses to stop carrying the weight. The imbalance stays hidden until one day that person quietly steps back and suddenly everything changes. This is where the real test begins. Most people fear walking away because they believe distance destroys relationships. In reality, distance doesn't destroy healthy relationships. It exposes unhealthy ones. If a single step backward causes the entire connection to disappear, then perhaps you were never walking together in the first place. Perhaps you were simply pulling someone who had already stopped moving. That realization is painful, but it is also freeing, because truth is always more valuable than comfortable illusion. Think about a bridge supported by two pillars. As long as both pillars remain strong, the bridge stands. But if one pillar quietly disappears, the entire structure collapses. The collapse does not create weakness. It simply exposes where weakness already existed. Relationships work the same way. When you stop making all the effort, you don't destroy the relationship. You simply reveal whether another foundation ever existed. This is why ignoring people becomes such a powerful psychological filter, not because silence forces everyone to return, but because silence removes the mask. The people who genuinely value you will notice your absence. They will reach out. They will ask if everything is all right. They will make an effort because your presence matters to them. The people who only valued your attention will simply wait for you to come back because they were never attached to you. They were attached to what you constantly gave them. There is a profound difference. Human psychology naturally seeks the easiest path. If someone becomes accustomed to receiving unlimited attention without giving much in return, that pattern quickly becomes normal. not because they are evil, but because the mind adapts to comfort. Comfort slowly becomes expectation. Expectation slowly becomes entitlement. And entitlement quietly destroys appreciation. That is why constantly rescuing one-sided relationships rarely makes them stronger. It usually makes the imbalance deeper. Every extra message, every unnecessary apology, every sacrifice made without respect teaches the other person that they don't have to change because you will continue doing the work for both of you. This is exactly why emotionally strong people are not afraid to step back. Not out of anger, not to punish anyone, but because they understand something most people never do. Effort is the only honest language that cannot be faked forever. Words can lie, promises can be broken, excuses can sound convincing, but consistent effort always tells the truth. Imagine watering a plant every single day. You give it sunlight, water, care, attention, but one day you stop not because you hate the plant, but because you want to see whether it can survive on its own roots. Relationships are no different. When you stop feeding them with endless effort, their true condition becomes visible. Some continue growing because both people were invested. Others wither immediately because only one person was keeping them alive. That truth hurts. But it also protects you from wasting years chasing people who were never running toward you. There is another reason this principle feels so powerful. When people suddenly lose unlimited access to your attention, they are forced to evaluate your importance. As long as you are always available, there is nothing to evaluate. Your presence feels permanent, but once it is no longer guaranteed, the mind begins asking questions. Why did they stop? Did I take them for granted? Was I expecting too much? Those questions often create awareness that constant availability never could. Remember, walking away is not about making someone suffer. It is about giving people the opportunity to show you who they really are, because respect cannot be begged for, loyalty cannot be forced, and genuine effort never needs to be chased. In the end, the darkest psychological truth is that ignoring people does not change their character. It simply removes the comfort that was hiding it. And the moment you stop carrying every relationship alone, you finally discover who values your presence and who only valued your endless effort. There is a level of power that very few people ever reach. It is not the power to make someone miss you. It is not the power to make people chase you. And it is certainly not the power to control another person's emotions. The greatest psychological advantage is much quieter than that. It is reaching a point where your peace no longer depends on anyone's attention, because the moment you no longer need validation from others, you become almost impossible to manipulate. And that is the final lesson behind the dark psychology of ignoring people. Most people spend their lives trying to control what others think about them. They worry about every opinion, every delayed reply, every cold conversation, every sign of rejection without realizing it. They have handed strangers the keys to their emotional world. Their mood rises when they receive attention. It falls when attention disappears. Their confidence depends on approval. Their peace depends on acceptance. This is exactly how emotional dependence is created. And emotional dependence is the foundation upon which manipulation quietly grows. The person who controls your need for validation often controls your behavior. That is why emotionally detached people seem so difficult to influence, not because they have stopped caring, but because they have stopped depending. There is an important difference. A detached person still values relationships, still respects people, still shows kindness, but they no longer abandon themselves simply to avoid losing someone else. That quiet shift changes everything. Imagine standing in the middle of a violent storm. The wind pushes in every direction. Rain crashes against you. Everything around you feels unstable. Now imagine a mountain standing in the middle of that same storm. The storm is real, the pressure is real, but the mountain remains exactly where it is. Emotionally detached people become like that mountain. Life still brings disappointment. People still misunderstand them. Some relationships still end, but their identity no longer collapses with every emotional challenge, because their peace comes from within, not from outside approval. This creates an extraordinary psychological effect. When people realize they cannot influence your emotions through attention, silence, approval, or rejection, they slowly lose the invisible control they once believed they had. Think about how many arguments begin because someone expected a reaction, how many manipulative games survive because someone keeps responding, how many toxic relationships continue because one person fears being alone. Remove that fear, and the entire psychological structure begins to collapse. The manipulator loses their greatest weapon because that weapon was never their words. It was your emotional dependence. Most people misunderstand ignoring people. They believe it is about making others suffer. But true emotional detachment has nothing to prove. It doesn't ignore people out of revenge. It simply refuses to sacrifice inner peace for external validation. That difference is enormous. One comes from bitterness, the other comes from maturity. People can always feel the difference. One creates temporary attention, the other creates lasting respect. There is another reason emotional detachment is so attractive. It communicates freedom. When someone knows you are choosing to stay instead of needing to stay, your presence feels genuine. When someone realizes you could walk away peacefully if respect disappears, your value increases because your attention is no longer driven by fear. It is guided by standards. Standards always command more respect than desperation. Eventually, something unexpected happens. You stop wondering who is thinking about you because your attention is no longer trapped inside someone else's mind. Instead, it returns to your own goals, your own purpose, your own growth. Ironically, that is often the moment people begin noticing you more than ever before, not because you chased attention, but because you stopped needing it. That quiet confidence cannot be copied, it cannot be acted, it cannot be forced. It is built through self-respect, patience, discipline, and the willingness to let people leave if they no longer belong in your life. This is the highest form of psychological power, not controlling another person, but mastering yourself, because once you master your own emotions, no one else can easily use them against you. In the end, the darkest psychological truth is not that ignoring people gives you power over them. It is that emotional detachment takes away the power they once had over you. And when your happiness is no longer controlled by another person's attention, your silence stops being a strategy. It becomes a reflection of genuine inner strength. That is the moment you become truly free.